Hello everyone, welcome to Earth Archives. Nowadays, there are endless fraud methods, and it is very likely that you will fall into a fraud trap if you are not careful. But do you know that fraud can also change history? Today, let's talk about 5 scam stories that changed history. Please subscribe to the show before it starts, and share it with your friends if possible. Every year, fraud steals more than $5 trillion from the global economy, according to Crow, a staggering sum that exceeds Japan's entire GDP. This colossal threat looms over the modern business landscape, an ever-present reminder of the vulnerabilities that lurk in both the digital and physical worlds. Fraud, once a petty crime, has evolved into an all-encompassing epidemic, now more complex and sophisticated than ever. From the simplest Wangiri scams to intricate schemes of identity theft and corporate espionage, fraudsters today are relentless, creative, and technologically savvy. But even as technology advances to combat these frauds, with companies like Neural Technologies deploying cutting-edge artificial intelligence and machine learning to track, adapt, and respond, the battle remains uphill. The reality is, while today's fraudsters exploit vulnerabilities in our digital systems, the truth is that people and processes have been targeted for fraud throughout human history. In fact, fraud has shaped and reshaped societies in ways that we still feel today. This week, let's journey through time and explore 5 monumental causes of fraud that not only altered economies and cultures but also transformed the very course of history. These are the frauds that left indelible marks on the world, proving that the fight against deception is as old as civilization itself. 1. Perkin Warbeck. 15th century Perkin Warbeck, a name almost forgotten by history, was the architect of one of the most audacious and daring cases of identity theft the world has ever known. While his name might not ring a bell to many, his story is woven into the fabric of one of the most turbulent and fascinating chapters in British history. In the late 15th century, when the winds of European politics were turbulent and allegiances were as fluid as they were deadly, Warbeck, a young and impressionable man, found himself swept up into a web of deception. The plot was crafted not by petty criminals or common swindlers but by ambitious men with grand designs, the loyalists of the deposed House of York. These supporters, eager to restore the Yorkist dynasty to the throne, saw in Warbeck an opportunity, a pawn who could be transformed into a figurehead for their cause. With the stroke of a few clever manipulations, they reshaped Warbeck's very identity. He was no longer Perkin Warbeck, a commoner, but Richard, Duke of York, the lost son of King Edward IV and rightful heir to the throne of England. The audacity of this deception was staggering. To assume the identity of a prince long believed to have been murdered in the Tower of London was not only brazen but dangerous. Yet, under this new guise, Warbeck became the focus of a growing rebellion. With newfound confidence, he began rallying supporters, amassing an army that would one day swell to 6,000 men. His claim to the throne was bolstered by the support of several powerful European royals, each with their own interests in destabilizing the Tudor monarchy. His deception, though brilliant in its audacity, was ultimately doomed to fail. King Henry VII, the reigning monarch of England, saw Warbeck not as a legitimate threat but as a puppet, a mere tool in the hands of those who would seek to undermine his reign. After a series of failed attempts to seize the throne, Warbeck was captured. Yet, in his brief rise and fall, he had demonstrated the enormous potential of identity fraud as a tool of political power. The consequences of Warbeck's deception were grave. Initially, he was treated with a degree of leniency by King Henry, perhaps due to his relatively humble origins and the fact that he had been manipulated by others. But as Warbeck attempted to escape from the tower where he was being held in 1499, the king's patience wore thin. The man who had once been a commoner now stood condemned, not for the crime of treason alone, but for the incredible deceit that had nearly toppled a monarchy. Perkin Warbeck's story ended in execution, his life snuffed out in a moment of tragic irony. He was hanged, a final, grim punctuation to a life spent impersonating a prince, a criminal whose bold fraud had challenged the very throne of England. Though he was ultimately forgotten by history, his audacious bid for power remains one of the most remarkable tales of identity theft, not for financial gain or personal enrichment, but for the highest and most dangerous prize of all, the British crown. 1. François and Joseph Blanc 1830s. It may come as a surprise, but the first documented case of telecommunications fraud occurred in France in 1837, nearly 50 years before Alexander Graham Bell patented his groundbreaking invention, the telephone. François and Joseph Blanc were traders on the Bordeaux Stock Exchange during the 1830s. Their primary business was in government bonds, whose valuations were heavily swayed by political developments and economic shifts in the French capital, Paris, 600 kilometers to the north. At the time, such a distance could take almost an entire week to traverse, a glaring vulnerability that the Blanc brothers were quick to exploit. The crown jewel of French technological advancement at the time was the optical telegraph, a network of towering structures equipped with massive wooden arms, which could be positioned to send coded messages across the country. Messages were relayed through the network, each tower passing on information to the next in line. François and Joseph saw an opportunity. They managed to bribe one of the signalmen, persuading him to send them insider information on the stock market changes in Paris. With this secret information, the Blanc brothers were able to act faster than their fellow traders, making lucrative bets on market fluctuations before the news could reach the rest of France. Despite the fact that their actions were clearly deceitful, the brothers managed to evade punishment. There was no law in France at the time that prohibited this particular form of manipulation. The absence of regulatory oversight allowed them to profit from this brazen act of fraud. This early case of fraud highlights the critical importance of modern regulation in preventing such schemes. Today, sophisticated laws and anti-fraud measures are in place to dissuade fraudsters from exploiting technological advancements for personal gain. The story of the Blanc brothers serves as a reminder of how easily vulnerabilities in communication systems can be exploited and how vital robust oversight is to protect against fraud. 1. Charles Ponzi 1920s. No discussion of history's most notorious frauds would be complete without mentioning the infamous Ponzi scheme, a scam so emblematic of deception that it bears the name of its architect, Charles Ponzi. His rise to infamy and his eventual downfall are an almost poetic reflection of how greed and ambition can snowball into a crisis of monumental proportions. Ponzi's story, though a century old, continues to serve as a cautionary tale, and it all began in the early 20th century. In the early days, Ponzi appeared like any other ambitious entrepreneur, a man with a plan to make a fortune. But his scheme wasn't one based on innovation or a new product. It was a cleverly orchestrated fraud, designed to prey on the hopes of the gullible. At the heart of the scam was a promise of astronomical returns, drawn from the purchase of international postal coupons, an idea that sounded too good to be true. Ponzi's pitch was simple. By buying international postal reply coupons in one country where they were undervalued, and selling them in another country where they were worth more, he could deliver huge profits to investors. What seemed to be a stroke of brilliance turned out to be an elaborate house of cards. Ponzi's charm was undeniable. He promised returns that were nothing short of miraculous. Investors were told that they could earn 50% returns within just 45 days, and 100% returns within 90 days. The attraction was irresistible to many. People rushed to hand over their money, eager to see their investments multiply. But Ponzi wasn't investing anyone's money in postal coupons. Instead, he used the funds from new investors to pay off earlier investors, creating the illusion of a profitable enterprise. The more people invested, the more Ponzi was able to sustain his facade, funneling money into the pockets of earlier participants to encourage further investments. The cycle fed itself, and the scheme appeared to be unstoppable. Ponzi's success was built on deception, and for a time, it worked spectacularly. But, as with all frauds, it eventually began to unravel. The cracks in the scheme started to show, and the wall of lies began to crumble. What ultimately brought Ponzi down was investigative journalism. The Boston Globe, through the relentless work of its reporters, exposed the cracks in his operation, revealing the sheer scale of the fraud. The journalists dug deep, uncovering Ponzi's web of deceit, and on August 12, 1920, the man who had once seemed untouchable was arrested, ending one of the most infamous frauds in history. Ponzi had promised riches, and he had delivered for a while, but only at the cost of those who followed him into the scam. His name, forever associated with the fraudulent scheme, remains a symbol of how easily greed can transform ambition into fraud, and how the hunger for easy returns can blind even the most sensible investors. Charles Ponzi's story is more than just a tale of a conman. It's a reminder of the dangers of unchecked promises and the importance of vigilance when something sounds too good to be true. 1. Wachovia Bank. In the shadowy world of international finance, where the lines between legitimate business and criminal enterprise often blur, vast sums of money flow through clandestine channels, evading scrutiny and regulation. The United Nations estimates that between $800 billion and $2 trillion is laundered annually, an astonishing 2 to 5% of global GDP. This staggering figure places the infamous Wachovia money laundering case in a chilling perspective. At the time, the case, involving $380 billion, was the largest money laundering scandal the world had ever seen, a record that still stands as a sobering reminder of the scale and sophistication of modern financial crime. The story behind the discovery of this massive laundering operation begins in 2006, on the tarmac of a dusty Mexican airstrip, far from the boardrooms of Wall Street or the polished offices of global banks. Mexican soldiers, in the course of an anti-drug operation, intercepted a small plane that was carrying a shipment of cocaine worth a staggering $100 million. The drugs were destined for markets in the United States, but it was not the drugs themselves that would set off a series of investigations leading to the uncovering of one of the most significant financial scandals in history. Instead, it was the plane's paper trail, a set of meticulously maintained records of ownership, that would unravel a web of financial deceit and reveal a far larger operation at play. As authorities dug deeper into the ownership of the plane, they found themselves tracing the ownership through layers of complex financial transactions that led them to the heart of the American banking system. The investigation revealed that the aircraft had been used as part of a sprawling money laundering network that had funneled a mind-boggling $378.4 billion through accounts at Wachovia, one of the largest banks in the United States at the time. This was no ordinary transaction. The amount was so massive that it amounted to nearly a third of Mexico's entire GDP, a staggering sum that passed through Wachovia's accounts with alarming ease, evading the bank's anti-money laundering safeguards. It wasn't just the scale of the operation that was shocking, but the sheer audacity with which the money moved. Over the years, billions of dollars had been funneled through the bank without any serious checks or questions being raised. Wachovia, either willfully or negligently, had failed to apply the most basic anti-money laundering due diligence to the vast transfers. Authorities soon realized that the scale of the operation was even larger than they had initially believed, with billions of dollars flowing through the bank in a well-coordinated effort to hide the origins of the illicit funds. The ensuing legal battle was a moment of reckoning for Wachovia. In 2010, the bank was forced to forfeit $100 million to the U.S. government in a settlement, a meager sum in comparison to the vast amounts that had passed through its accounts. Additionally, Wachovia was slapped with a $50 million fine for its failure to adequately monitor and report suspicious financial activity. Despite this, the damage was done, and the bank's reputation was forever tarnished. As the global financial crisis unfolded in 2008, Wachovia was acquired by Wells Fargo, its once prominent brand now a footnote in the history of corporate malfeasance. The Wachovia case serves as a stark reminder of the vulnerabilities within the global financial system, vulnerabilities that allow criminals to move billions of dollars with little more than a nod and a wink from the institutions charged with safeguarding the integrity of the world's financial networks. It also underscores the immense power of the financial industry, where vast sums of money can be moved across borders with minimal oversight, often to the benefit of those engaged in the most nefarious activities. Yet, in the end, it was not just the criminals who profited from these illicit activities but also the financial institutions that, whether by design or negligence, turned a blind eye to the transactions that flowed through their accounts. 1. Barings Bank 1995. The fifth and final fraud on our list is the story of Barings Bank, a tale of reckless ambition, unchecked power, and a catastrophic fall from grace that shook the very foundations of the financial world. At the center of this disaster stood Nick Leeson, a rogue trader whose actions would unravel the UK's oldest and once most prestigious investment bank. Barings, founded in 1762, was a symbol of financial stability and history, until, in 1995, it was brought to its knees by the actions of one man, operating with a near-complete lack of oversight and accountability. Nick Leeson had been appointed head of Barings Bank's operations in Singapore, managing the bank's burgeoning futures trading business in Asia. With a sharp mind and a flair for high-risk investments, Leeson quickly rose to prominence, entrusted with significant responsibility. However, beneath the veneer of success, his actions began to spiral out of control. Operating in a highly speculative market, he began gambling enormous sums of money, over $1 billion on unhedged derivatives positions. These were risky bets, and once the market began to turn against him, the losses piled up with terrifying speed. What made Leeson's actions so audacious was not just the scale of the bets, but the lengths to which he went to cover them up. Falsifying internal records and manipulating the bank's accounting systems, he hid his losses and misled his superiors about the true state of Barings' finances. For months, Leeson was able to maintain the illusion of success, all the while continuing to gamble on the markets, betting more and more in a desperate attempt to recover his mounting losses. But when the markets didn't cooperate, the financial hole he had dug became too large to conceal. Remarkably, it wasn't an internal audit, regulatory oversight, or even the bank's own risk management systems that uncovered the fraud. Instead, it was a letter from Leeson himself, sent to the bank's head office as his losses grew beyond any hope of recovery. In a desperate act of confession, Leeson revealed the depth of the financial disaster he had caused, detailing the magnitude of the losses that had already sunk Barings Bank. By the time the truth was known, it was too late. Barings was beyond saving, and in February 1995, it was declared bankrupt. The collapse of Barings Bank revealed a profound failure in both the bank's internal controls and the regulatory framework that should have been in place to prevent such a disaster. Leeson had been allowed to occupy a position of near total power, where he managed both the trading positions and the oversight of his own actions. This staggering lack of separation between duties meant there was no independent check on his activities. In effect, he had the ability to both make bets on the market and hide the evidence of his losses, a situation ripe for abuse, which he exploited to the fullest. The fall of Barings sent shockwaves through the global financial industry. It was a wake-up call to the financial world, revealing just how vulnerable even the most established institutions could be to fraud and mismanagement. In the wake of the scandal, regulatory bodies around the world took swift action, enacting far stricter rules for risk management, oversight, and reporting. Banks were required to implement more rigorous internal controls to ensure that no single individual could wield so much unchecked power. Reporting standards for derivatives trading were tightened, and a greater emphasis was placed on transparency in financial operations. The collapse of Barings Bank, and the role Nick Leeson played in its downfall, would become a defining moment in the history of modern banking. It was a tragic reminder of the dangers of greed, the importance of accountability, and the catastrophic consequences that can result from a failure to properly oversee the complex world of financial trading.